George, it's great to be able to catch up with you. You're up in Walgett, I believe, a similar day to Adelaide. We're about 37 degrees in Adelaide, but we get nice and cool at night. Does it get nice and cool up in Walgett in the evening?
Look, it's starting to warm up at the moment, and it'll be warm all through the
night. Sorry, mate. We get a nice cool breeze this evening, so I'll be thinking of you as I'm cool in bed. George, I met you when I was up in Lightning Ridge, which is just 80 k's north of Walgett, and you were part of our church family, part of our friendship group. You and your wife, Carmel, I think, first said to us, you don't have family in Lightning Ridge, so we'll be your family, and you guys were, along with a number of other people. So I class you as a great friend, and it helped us, I think, in our time in Lightning Ridge just to thrive, and our children to thrive and that sort of stuff. So thanks for agreeing to be put in the hot seat as I ask you some questions about reconciliation, particularly obviously focusing on Aboriginal reconciliation. Thanks for that, mate.
That's okay, yeah, my pleasure.
In the conversation just before I started recording, you'd mentioned, and you mentioned it the other day, that when you were born, you were registered under the Flora and Fauna Act because Aboriginal people weren't allowed to be registered under another act. Is that right?
That's right, yeah. So I wasn't born an Australian citizen. I was classed with the animals, the flora and the fauna.
Yeah, and you're about the same age as me anyhow. So that shows how recent the official policy of Australian governments have been towards Aboriginal people. Yeah.
Right up to our lifetime, or my lifetime, yeah.
Yeah. Your family's had a long history, obviously, Aboriginal people standing up for Aboriginal rights, and trying to get the recognition of Aboriginal people as being equal to everyone else in society. Have things changed, do you think, over the time? Like your experience as being an Aboriginal today compared to, say, your grandparents or your parents' position?
Yeah, things have actually changed a lot since them days when my parents were younger. But just a bit of background. So, like Rick said, I was born under that Flora and Fauna Act. I was raised on the Aboriginal reserve at Collarenebri, which is not far from here. And but as I grew up, I lived in that Aboriginal community and with my family, and there was always that little safety net around me with my Aboriginal community and family. But every time that I'd come out of that community, like we go uptown or go somewhere, you'd have to come out of that safety net of that community into this non-Aboriginal, like threatening, unsafe environment. And yeah, back in the day, it was pretty in your face. Because I remember Mum and Dad saying they'd go into a shop to buy some food, like when they were travelling, and they wouldn't get served. They'd have to go out and try and find another shop where they could get served. And little things like that, and if they wanted to boil some water up with a metho burner, they couldn't buy metho at a shop because it was considered that Aboriginal people would just go and drink that for alcohol. So there was a lot of little things like that back in the day. And those things have changed nowadays. Like we can go into a shop and buy metho without being questioned if we're going to drink it or not. Yeah.
So there has been some, would you say, good change or positive change? But George, you're one of the few ordained Aboriginal people in Australia, and there's even in the church context, there's that a failure to recognise Aboriginal people in the same way they might recognise other people. Do you think that's still happening?
In some churches it is, some denominations, particularly like I could talk about my my mum and her family. The denomination that they grew up in, it was for Aboriginal people, but it never accepted Aboriginal people as being able to be authority in the church. And so, yeah, there was no like ordained pastors or ministers in that denomination. There was always, the Aboriginal people were always the associate worker to the white missionary, they call them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. One of the things that opened my eye up a fair bit, George, was that One Blood book. I do have it here somewhere, but here it is. I'll get it for you. Yeah, I don't know whether you've seen that book, and I asked you if you read it, and you made the comment to me, you haven't read it, but you've lived some of it. So you don't need to read the books about the way Aboriginal people have been treated in Australia. You've actually lived through it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like growing up, if it wasn't uncommon if you like if you went to a school camp or something, you'd be isolated and called names and stuff like that, you know.
Yep.
It was, nothing was new.
Yeah.
And you just expected that when you went on a camp that you'd be ridiculed and bullied.
Yep. Yep.
And growing up then into the workforce, quite often, you know, there'd be a derogative joke and it'd be sort of pointed in your direction and all that sort of stuff, you know.
Yeah. Now, George, we could probably talk forever about the poor way or the bad way that Aboriginal people have been treated in Australia by Christians and non-Christians, and we'll touch on some of that, I guess. But if we wanted to do a better job, we're talking about reconciliation. What would reconciliation look like from an Aboriginal perspective? It's easy for me to impose my views of what I think reconciliation might be, but if I was going to ask you as an Aboriginal person, or maybe an Aboriginal community, what would reconciliation really look like from your perspective?
Yeah, well, look, I don't think that enough has been done in the way of reconciliation, and look, I don't think it ever will be or ever it can be.
Yep.
Yeah, because I think like colonisation, it's gone too far in this country.
Yeah. How do you reverse it? How do you take it back to what it was in a more equitable thing, you know, 250 years ago?
Yeah, there's no way that, you know, you can turn back that time.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so I don't think it'll ever get back to where it was. But, you know, there's an expectation for us as Aboriginal people to just, I suppose, to appreciate the way that, you know, the wealth has been brought into this country. And I suppose the luxuries that we can take advantage of in this day and age.
Yep.
You know, but the colonisation or the colonists, they don't think about the cost that it had on our environment,
yeah,
and also the impact that it's had on our culture. You know.
Yeah.
And to them, they were things that weren't important back then. It was just that thought that, well, the Aboriginal people, they're not taking advantage of this environment. They're not exploiting it. They just appreciate it and living in it. And so yeah, the white settlers, they come in and they just exploited the land and just didn't worry about anyone's culture.
Yeah. And
just yeah, served their own good and their own needs, and they just exploited everything.
So how we try and move to a more helpful situation now? If we can't reverse it, how would we? What would be the sort of thinking we'd want to be doing? Maybe as individuals as well as a Christian community. Can you got any thoughts on that, George?
Yeah, well, as you know, like for true reconciliation, it's the party that's done wrong, isn't it?
Yeah.
That they need to admit that they've done the wrong thing, and then come and ask for forgiveness, and then do whatever they can do to put things right. Now, I think it's gone too far for that to happen. But you know, over the years, there's been some attempts to try and and bring to light the mistakes that have been made in the past, and try to learn by those mistakes, I suppose. And for the last 16 years before I got into ministry, I worked in the health service, and they realised in health that for us health workers to have an impact with the Aboriginal community that we serve in, we need to train people about culture and just make them aware of like the difference in the culture. Yeah. And so they had cultural workshops, and you know, it was a real awareness for some of the non-Indigenous workers to go to these workshops, and you know, it made an impact, because after these workshops, I had a few non-Indigenous health workers come to me, and they were in tears, and they didn't realise what had happened. Yeah. And they were truly repentant and sorry, but there was nothing that they could do. They were sorry, but there was nothing that they could do. And so we need to learn by those mistakes that, you know, like there's no difference between any nationality or any people. We've all sinned and fall short of God's glory. You know, so there's no difference between us. Yeah. You know, we come from Adam's race, and we're all the one people. Yeah.
And so part of what I hear you saying is actually for people who are not Aboriginal to actually hear the story of what's happened to the Aboriginal people is a big step towards a reconciliation. It might not be able to rewind everything back to being a healthy, no damage done situation, but at least understanding the story of what's happened. Do you think that's a key thing?
Oh yeah, that's a huge step forward.
Yeah.
Yeah. See, there's times when you know, I'll be having morning tea, and like a non-Aboriginal bloke would come over and say, look, oh, you're just a bunch of whingers. You whinge for this, you whinge for that, you always whinging for rights to do this and that. And you say, hang on a minute, do you know why we're asking for these rights? You know, we've just been pushed back into the back corner, yeah, and had everything taken off us. And, you know, we're trying to stand up now and say, look, we're an equal people. Yeah. You know, don't keep pushing us down all the time. And so it's just ignorance that people don't know what we've been through, yeah, or what we've experienced, you know. And these sorts of workshops have really enlightened people to where we've come from and what we've had to go through.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you know, certainly that reading of One Blood for me was just a massive insight into what Aboriginal people have been through, not just in your lifetime, but since colonisation. And therefore it legitimises their asking for a bit more recognition and a bit more care. You know, you can understand where people are coming from far better when you know what's been done to them in history. Yeah. Now, George, I'm going to have to edit some of this because it's not going to fit in all the time, of course. But how can we as Christians be positive agents for healing? That would be we're talking about reconciliation. How can we as Christians be positive agents for healing, given that stuff's happened in the past? And even if I know this history and I know the story, how can I be a more positive agent for reconciliation?
See, unfortunately, like back in the early days of colonisation, when us Aboriginal people, we lived under government policies, many children were taken from their families against their will. And so they were put into these orphanages, and they were run by lots of different churches. And, you know, unfortunately, the Christian people that were running these orphanages weren't really Christians. They were still living in their fallen, sinful ways. And it wasn't a pleasant experience for a lot of Aboriginal children that were taken. Yep. And so, like, this is in my lifetime that people were put in orphanages and taken from their families. Yep. And so a lot of people that I meet today are bitter against the churches because of those things that have happened.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so the only way that we can move forward, I guess, as Christians, is that we need to be faithful to the scriptures and teach them that the gospel in love and truth, you know, and to live our lives in light of the hope that we have in our Lord Jesus.
Yep.
And then be willing to tell people when they ask us about the hope that we have.
Yeah, yeah. And so that's we still need that same offer of the gospel to Aboriginal people as we do to every person who lives in this broken world. And so reconciliation is about sharing the same message of Jesus without a doubt. And at some level, as a church, acknowledging maybe as a church we haven't done things well in the past. We could have done better. We've done maybe the best of what we tried at the time, but we could have done things better if we, for one of the way to put it, been more aware of things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just acknowledge that, yeah, we haven't done as good as we could have done. Yeah.
Yeah. I remember when I was in the Ridge, Roy Barker, who's an uncle of yours, I believe, is that correct?
Yeah, he is.
Yeah. So I remember Roy, after one of the funerals I conducted, saying, my people need the gospel. And that really stuck with me. I wasn't always good at trying to engage Aboriginal people with that gospel. And I probably could have done it better if I had a better appreciation of what some of them had struggled with. But I remember Roy saying that my people need the gospel.
Yeah.
And that was after a number of Aboriginal funerals all in a row. Yeah, so, yeah. Well, if we've recognised some of our failings, and I've got a better understanding of what some of the grievances and the needs of Aboriginal people are, what's I live in Adelaide, in a suburb where our Aboriginal people who live around us, not necessarily right next to us. Can you think of ways that we can, as a church, better engage, say, the Aboriginal people who will mostly come from out the APY lands in Adelaide? How can we better engage them with the hope of Jesus?
Yeah. It comes back to that same thing we just discussed in a previous question. You know, we need to be open and honest.
Yeah.
And now that people get an understanding of where we come from, what we've been through, and you know yourself, if you know someone's background, it makes it easier to relate and to build a rapport.
Yeah.
And so I think that's one of the key things is, as people are aware of our past issues, and those government policies that were just not helpful to anyone, just to understand that, like, we're no different to anyone else. We're all descendants of Adam, and there's no difference. And so as Christians and as a church, we need to be honest and open with those that we want to share the gospel with. Yep. And especially, like, nothing worse than you talking to someone that they're trying to talk down to you like you don't understand you from some lost tribe. So definitely don't do that.
No, that's right. Yeah. And that can easily happen, can't it?
It can, yeah.
Yep. George, it's become fairly common in Australian culture to recognise the Aboriginal people, and I think that's, from what you're saying, that's actually quite a good thing, generally. And to recognise the Aboriginal story and where their journey's been. Often in that context, we as Christians might be asked to participate in smoking ceremonies. Now, from the way I understand it, smoking ceremonies are really there to drive away the evil spirits. Is that correct? Or have I got a misunderstanding of it?
Well, yeah, that is one of the aspects of it. There's actually two parts to it, from what I experience. there's the like driving away the evil spirits, and also a cleansing aspect of it as well.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So my question that I'm leading towards, George, is how can I, as a Christian, participate well in a smoking ceremony then? You got some thoughts?
Yeah, as Christians, I don't think that we don't need to participate in smoking ceremonies. If someone does, like out our way, I do a lot of funerals, and here in Walgett, and you know, people do want to have a smoking ceremony. I don't stop them from having it, but I don't participate in it.
Yep.
And I don't let people do a smoking ceremony in our church.
Yep.
If they want to do one, it's down at the graveside. And if they want people to walk through the smoke down there, that's fine.
Yep.
But I don't incorporate that into my teaching at all, one little bit.
Yeah, okay, thanks. That's helpful to know. So why should I stop people doing it? It's not something you to participate in. Is that what I'm understanding well there, George?
Well, what I mean by don't participate is, like, I don't get up and say, look, we're going to have this smoking ceremony now and it's going to do this or that.
Yeah.
I just let the person that's doing the ceremony, just before I say anything, because normally as the body's been carried over to the graveside.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, like I'll walk through the smoke. It's just, there's no difference.
It's just smoke.
Yeah, it'll probably get in your eyes and make you cry, but that's all it is.
Yeah,
it's only smoke.
Yep.
Yeah, and that's all. I won't say no, or I won't say this is a good thing. I'll walk through the smoke with the rest of the people.
Yep.
Because you're walking in the line, aren't you?
Yep, that's right.
Yeah, and then yeah, that's all I'll do. Yeah.
Yeah, and one of the things you brought, and you talked about how brought out the way Aboriginal people are connected to the land far better. You know, you lived in the land and enjoyed the land, whereas it seemed to be the driven culture of the colonial thinking was to exploit the land for material purposes. And so we had this very conflicting, different understanding of country. And so obviously in our culture today, we have lots of Aboriginal welcome to country ceremonies. Have you got any thoughts on whether they're a good thing? How can we participate in them well? Any thoughts on that, George?
Yeah, look, I think they are a good thing, but what we see as our welcome to country is completely different to what traditional welcome to country is. It's only just a fraction of it.
Yeah.
And so whereas we get together now when we might remember the traditional custodians of this land, both past and present, you know, if a person was going to travel back in the day, you know, they'd have to prepare themselves to enter into this other person's land. And the people of that land where they were entering, they would have to make preparation for this person coming in. So it was a two-way stream.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just an overnight thing. It took preparation and ceremony, they call it. Yeah. But I think it's a good thing that we're acknowledging that this land did belong to other people, and you know, and that we acknowledge the leaders that were both past and present of this land.
Yeah. Thanks, George. I thank you for the time. I'm going to have a lot of trouble cutting this down to a short space in the service. I might actually cut it up and then put it on our YouTube site so people can see the wider interview, the whole interview. But I really thank you for your input. There's a whole pile of questions I'm sure I could have asked. Maybe ones, if we had longer time, we could spend more talking about. But I do thank you. Have you got anything that, you know, maybe I wished I'd asked a better question, or things that maybe we've missed out in things in our talking that would be helpful to know, George?
Yeah, you've mentioned part of your question is that I've lost my space here.
That's all right, mate.
About how we're we're part of, you know, how God has made a lot of different people out into one nation, you know.
Yeah.
And because we're Aboriginal people, you know, how do we fit into that part of one nation?
Yeah.
I was just reading this morning about in Revelation 5:9 and 10. You know, about and they sang a new song saying, "You are worthy to take the scroll and to open its seals, because you were slain, and with your blood you purchased for God persons from every tribe and language and people and nation. You've made them to be kingdom and priest to serve our God, and they will reign on the earth." You know, that's the gospel in a nutshell, isn't it? How Christ died for our sins, buried and raised again from the dead. And that's what we have to do, to preach the gospel to all nations. Yeah.
And that includes the Aboriginal people as much as it does to people all around this world, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it'll be our prayer that, you know, as a church where we are, not only we understand the story, the backstory, but we as a church have that heart to take the gospel to all the nations. And even if we can't repair the damage done all the way in the past, we can move forward in a more positive and God-honoring way. I think that's one of our great desires.
Yeah. Well, that's our goal and our vision, isn't it? To bring all people to Christ and to help them home to heaven. Yeah.
Thanks, mate.
No worries, my pleasure.